American troops who were transferred from Europe to the Pacific in 1945 in many ways experienced an even harsher form of combat in the Pacific theater, fighting against Japan. The Japanese were a very ruthless, difficult, and vicious enemy, and I'll be describing parts of this in more detail over the next several slides. Of course, the early going in the Pacific was a string of defeats for the United States, beginning with the attack at Pearl Harbor. At the same time that the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, they attacked every other significant American installation in the Pacific, from places down near Australia, through the Philippines, up to the Aleutian Islands, and a string of other American strongholds, places like Guam, Wake Island, the Gilbert Islands, and so on. The pattern was similar in each of these cases, where American forces stationed at these sites were left deserted without hope of being reinforced or replenished, because the American fleet had been virtually destroyed at the attack at Pearl Harbor. The most stark of these situations occurred in the Philippines, and the results of that battle are known as the Bataan Death March. American forces in the Philippines continued to fight on, even after they knew they were not going to be saved and they could not get reinforcements or supplies. These forces fought on often until they had nothing but their knife or their bayonet, and eventually they were all captured by April of 1942. So bear in mind, this is 4 to 5 months after the attack at Pearl Harbor. These prisoners of war were forced by the Japanese to march to their prison camps. There were about 80,000 Filipino and American prisoners of war taken. You see there the picture at the right. This was their condition during the march. These are soldiers who have been living for 3 or 4 months without supplies, and so in many cases they were already weakened and exhausted, not doing well. The Japanese treated them horribly over the course of this march. They were not given much in the way of food or water. Sometimes they were forced to carry heavy items along with them, and if anyone fell by the wayside, they would be shot or bayoneted by the Japanese. This became one of the most notorious episodes of the entire war. We can only estimate the number of casualties along the way, but about 10,000 Filipinos were killed by the Japanese, and as many as 650 Americans were killed during this march. This was our introduction to the war in the Pacific. The Japanese were a brutal and vicious enemy. They showed no mercy or remorse. And so we came to feel differently about fighting the Japanese than we did in some ways about fighting the Germans, who were also a very difficult enemy and could be ruthless at times. But the Japanese, we came to view them as something less than human. And really the war in the Pacific was fought with a much higher degree of simple hatred and disrespect for each opponent than the war in Europe. The momentum in the Pacific theater began to swing in June of 1942 with the Battle of Midway Island. This was really the turning point of the war in the Pacific. And again, it followed a steady string of defeats in the early part of the war. Now, the United States, as I've mentioned to you previously, had cracked Japanese radio codes, and so we understood that they were preparing some sort of significant attack at this time. But we weren't certain of the location of that attack. Midway Island was certainly a logical site. As you can see from the map, it is sort of on the way. It's not quite halfway between Hawaii and Japan. And so it looked to be a logical target. But the United States actually played a bit of a ruse on the Japanese to confirm the site. We sent out a radio message saying that Midway Island was running low on fresh water. And sure enough, a Japanese radio message came back, something like, Target X is running low on fresh water. And so we then knew that the attack was coming at Midway Island. And so we had sent our carrier force. Remember that the American carriers were not damaged at the attack at Pearl Harbor, and this is when it really becomes critical. We sent our carrier force so that they would be there sort of behind the Midway Islands, and the Japanese, when they launched their attack, and you can see they had this massive invasion force, they had their own carrier force, and when they launched their attack, their planes took off from the carriers. The United States launched a counterattack. Our planes attacked their carriers. We managed to sink 3 of their carriers and badly damaged a 4th during that attack. And so the Japanese pilots, when they came back from their attack of Midway Island, in many cases they found only, we can imagine, debris, rubble floating in the water, you know, oil slicks, flames in the water, but no carriers to land on. And so they circled and circled and circled and finally crashed into the sea. The Japanese lost not only 3 carriers, but hundreds of some of their best pilots during this battle. And so it becomes a real turning point. One of the things I've mentioned already, and we'll discuss a little bit more, is that for the Japanese, it was much more difficult for them to replace and replenish the material and ships and airplanes that were lost, and even pilots that were lost. I mentioned earlier that the United States essentially replaced the ships sunk at Pearl Harbor 100 times over by the time the war ended. The Japanese could not keep up with that kind of production. And so in some ways that's the story of the later stages of the war in the Pacific. It becomes a contest of production and just the ability to make supplies. And so after the battle at Midway Island, the momentum really turns in the Pacific. And the rest of the war became a process of what has come to be called island hopping, which is a sort of cute little nickname for the process of the American forces getting closer and closer to Japan itself. But in fact, it was some of the harshest fighting in the war, extremely harsh fighting. These are volcanic islands. They are rocky and craggy, filled with little caves and holes, and the Japanese troops would really dig themselves in. And of course, with no concept of surrender, they would fight viciously to the last man, making for extremely harsh fighting. And this is just a map that gives you sort of a better idea of what that process of island hopping involved. The American fleet was divided into 2 large components, and the northern part took some of the smaller islands along the way, places like the Gilbert Islands, the Marshall Islands, the Mariana Islands. And if you look, I mean, several of these names are among the famous battles of this war: Tarawa, Guam, Saipan, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. And then the more southerly route took some of the bigger islands along the way, but you also see battles like Guadalcanal, the Leyte Gulf, the Philippines, Manila, and so on. Eventually, these 2 prongs of the American fleet are getting closer and closer to Japan itself. And if you look at the map again, the Battle of the Mariana Islands was very important because at that point we were close enough to launch bombers, long-range bombers, that could attack Tokyo and Japan itself. The Battle of Iwo Jima was important because now we were close enough to send fighter support along with the bombers. And then the Battle of Okinawa brought us close enough. That was really the last major battle before we could contemplate an invasion of Japan itself. Those final few battles in the Pacific theater brought us closer and closer to the big island of Japan, leading us to contemplate our options for winning the war itself. The last of these major battles was the battle for Okinawa, a very large island to the south of Japan. It was some of the harshest fighting in the Pacific. The battle lasted for 82 days, from April through June of 1945. It was the largest amphibious attack in the Pacific and was nicknamed the Typhoon of Steel for the sheer amount of ships and weaponry that was used in this assault. It also marked some of the most desperate fighting on the side of Japan. The Japanese implemented many kamikaze pilots during this final battle, as they had begun to do in the late stages of the Pacific War. Kamikazes, I'm sure you are familiar with this. They are essentially suicide pilots. Kind of a sad story in many cases. These were sometimes young boys, 13, 14, 15-year-old boys. They would train them just enough to fly the plane. They wouldn't train them how to land. Give them a shot of sake or two, strap the plane full of bombs, and send them on their way. And we can only imagine what might have gone through some of their minds once they were airborne, knowing that there is no going back, there's no landing. And many of these planes were shot down or crashed unsuccessfully into the sea, but those that did strike American ships had a devastating effect. With the Battle of Okinawa, the United States then begins contemplating options for bringing the war to an end. And about a month later, in July 1945, Harry Truman received word from a group of scientists in Los Alamos, New Mexico, that the United States had perfected the atomic bomb. Harry Truman wrote in his diary that day, "We have discovered the most terrible bomb in the history of the world." And so here we have one option for how this war might come to an end. Now, I think it may seem like a foregone conclusion that Harry Truman would immediately decide, of course, we're going to use the bomb. But it was a much more difficult decision and one that Truman wrestled with. Consider that Truman knew that using such a bomb would lead to the death of untold numbers of civilians. And while on the one hand we might say this is the cost of war, on the other hand the United States generally has not made a habit of killing large numbers of civilians if we have other options. A counter-argument that Truman had to consider was that this was simply the next step in terms of technology. There were already very powerful weapons that had been employed. We had already killed tens of thousands, perhaps hundreds of thousands of civilians. As one example, the United States had implemented incendiary bombs or fire bombs several different times during the war, including a few times in Japan itself, where the buildings, which are made of wood or very thin paper-like material, some of them, went up in these horrible torrents of flame. And so we had killed more than 100,000 Japanese in a single attack with these incendiary bombs. So, are we going to use the atomic bomb or not? It was, of course, Truman's decision to